All electric. J. B. Strobel has a 2-inch long scar that cuts across the middle of his left cheek. He earned it in high school, during a chemistry class experiment. Strobel whipped up the wrong concoction of chemicals, and the beaker he was holding exploded, throwing off shards of glass, one of which sliced through his face. The wound lingers as a tinkerer's badge of honor. It arrived near the end of a childhood full of experimentation with chemicals and machines. Born in Wisconsin, Strobel constructed a large chemistry lab in the basement of his family's home that included fume hoods and chemicals ordered, borrowed, or pilfered. At 13, Strobel found an old golf cart at the dump. He brought it back home and restored it to working condition, which required him to rebuild the electric motor. It seemed that Strobel was always taking something apart, sprucing it up, and putting it back together. All of this fit into the Strobel family's do-it-yourself traditions. In the late 1890s, Strobel's great-grandfather started the Strobel Machine Company, which built one of the first internal combustion engines in the United States and used it to power boats. Strobel's inquisitive spirit carried him west to Stanford University, where he enrolled in 1994, intending to become a physicist. After flying through the hardest courses he could take, Strobel concluded that majoring in physics would not be for him. The advanced courses were too theoretical, and Strobel liked to get his hands dirty. He developed his own major called Energy Systems and Engineering. "I wanted to take software and electricity and use it to control energy," Strobel said. "It was computing, combined with power electronics. I collected all the things I loved doing in one place." There was no clean technology movement at this time, but there were companies dabbling with new uses for solar power and electric vehicles. Strobel ended up hunting down these startups, hanging out in their garages and pestering the engineers. He began tinkering once again on his own as well in the garage of a house he shared with a half-dozen friends. Strobel bought a piece of shit Porsche for $1,600 and turned it into an electric car. This meant that Strobel had to create a controller to manage the electric motor, build a charger from scratch, and write the software that made the entire machine work. The car set the world record for electric vehicle acceleration, traveling a quarter mile in 17.28 seconds. The thing I took away was that the electronics were great, and you could get acceleration on a shoestring budget, but the batteries sucked, Strobel said. It had a 30-mile range, so I learned firsthand about some of the limitations of electric vehicles. Strobel gave his car a hybrid boost, building a gasoline-powered contraption that could be towed behind the Porsche and used to recharge the batteries. It was good enough for Strobel to drive the 400 miles down to Los Angeles and back. By 2002, Strobel was living in Los Angeles. He'd gotten a master's degree from Stanford and bounced around a couple of companies looking for something that called out to him. He decided on Rosen Motors, which had built one of the world's first hybrid vehicles, a car that ran off a flywheel and a gas turbine and had electric motors to drive the wheel. After it folded, Strobel followed Harold Rosen, an engineer famed for inventing the geostationary satellite, to create an electric plane. "I'm a pilot and love to fly, so this was perfect for me," Strobel said. The idea was that it would stay aloft for 2 weeks at a time and hover over a specific spot. This was way before drones and all that. To help make ends meet, Strobel also worked nights and on the weekend doing electronics consulting for a startup. It was in the midst of toiling away on all these projects that Strobel's old buddies from the Stanford solar car team came to pay him a visit. A group of rogue engineers at Stanford had been working on solar cars for years, building them in a World War II-era Quonset hut full of toxic chemicals and black widows. Unlike today, when the university would jump at the chance to support such a project, Stanford tried to shut down this group of fringe freaks and geeks. The students proved very capable of doing the work on their own and competed in cross-country solar-powered car races. Strobel helped build the vehicles during his time at university and even after, forming relationships with the incoming crop of engineers. The team had just raced 2,300 miles from Chicago to Los Angeles, and Strobel offered the strapped, exhausted kids a place to stay. About a half-dozen students showed up at Strobel's place, took their first showers in many days, and then spread across his floor. As they chatted late into the night, Strobel and the solar team kept fixating on one topic. They realized that lithium-ion batteries, such as the ones in their car being fed by the sun, had gotten much better than most people realized. Many consumer electronics devices like laptops were running on so-called 18,650 lithium-ion batteries, which looked a lot like our batteries and could be strung together. We wondered what would happen if you put 10,000 of the battery cells together, Strobel said. We did the math and figured you could go almost 1,000 miles. It was totally nerdy shit, and eventually everyone fell asleep, but the idea really stuck with me. Soon enough, Strobel was stalking the solar car crew, trying to talk them into building an electric car based on the lithium-ion batteries. He would fly up to Palo Alto, spend the night sleeping in his plane, and then ride a bicycle to the Stanford campus to make his sales pitch while helping with their current projects. The design Strobel had come up with was a super aerodynamic vehicle with 80% of its mass made up of the batteries. It looked quite a bit like a torpedo on wheels. No one knew the exact details of Strobel's long-term vision for this thing, including Strobel. The plan seemed to be less about forming a car company than about building a proof-of-concept vehicle just to get people thinking about the power of the lithium-ion batteries. With any luck, they would find a race to compete in. The Stanford students agreed to join Strobel if he could raise some money. He began going to trade shows, handing out brochures about his idea and emailing just about anyone he could think of. I was shameless, he said. The only problem was that no one had any interest in what Strobel was selling. Investors dealt him one rejection after another for months on end. Then, in the fall of 2003, Strobel met Elon Musk. Harold Rosen had set up a lunch with Musk at a seafood restaurant near the SpaceX headquarters in Los Angeles and brought Strobel along to help talk up the electric plane idea. When Musk didn't bite on that, Strobel announced his electric car side project. The crazy idea struck an immediate chord with Musk, who had been thinking about electric vehicles for years. While Musk had mostly focused on using ultracapacitors for the vehicles, he was thrilled and surprised to hear how far the lithium-ion battery technology had progressed. Everyone else had told me I was nuts, but Elon loved the idea, Strobel said. He said, "Sure, I will give you some money." Musk promised Strobel $10,000 of the $100,000 he was seeking. On the spot, Musk and Strobel formed a kinship that would survive more than a decade of extreme highs and lows as they set out to do nothing less than change the world. After the meeting with Musk, Strobel reached out to his friends at AC Propulsion. The Los Angeles-based company started in 1992 and was the bleeding edge of electric vehicles, building everything from zippy midsize passenger jobs right on up to sports cars. Strobel really wanted to show Musk the Zero from T0, the highest-end vehicle in AC Propulsion stable. It was a type of kit car that had a fiberglass body sitting on top of a steel frame and went from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4.9 seconds. When first unveiled in 1997, Strobel had spent years hanging out with the AC Propulsion crew and asked Tom Gage, the company's president, to bring a Zero over for Musk to drive. Musk fell for the car. He saw its potential as a screaming fast machine that could shift the perception of electric cars from boring and plodding to something aspirational. For months Musk offered to fund an effort to transform the kit car into a commercial vehicle but got rebuffed time and again. It was a proof of concept and needed to be made real, Strobel said. I love the hell out of the AC Propulsion guys, but they were sort of hopeless at business and refused to do it. They kept trying to sell Elon on this car called the E-Box that looked like shit, didn't have good performance, and was just uninspiring. While the meetings with AC Propulsion didn't result in a deal, they had solidified Musk's interest in backing something well beyond Strobel's science project. In a late February 2004 email to Gage, Musk wrote, "What I'm going to do is figure out the best choice of a high-performance base car and electric powertrain and go in that direction." Unbeknownst to Strobel, at about the same time, a couple of business partners in Northern California had also fallen in love with the idea of making a lithium-ion battery-powered car. Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning had founded Novomedia in 1997 to create one of the earliest electronic book readers. Called the Rocket ebook, the work at Novomedia had given the men insight into cutting-edge consumer electronics and the hugely improved lithium-ion batteries used to power laptops and other portable devices. While the Rocket ebook was too far ahead of its time and not a major commercial success, it was innovative enough to attract the attention of Gemster International Group, which owned TV Guide and some electronic programming guide technology. Gemster paid $187 million to acquire Novomedia in March 2000. Spoils in hand, the co-founders stayed in touch after the deal. They both lived in Woodside, one of the wealthiest towns in Silicon Valley, and chatted from time to time about what they should tackle next. We thought up some goofball things, said Tarpenning. There was one plan for these fancy irrigation systems for farms and the home based on smart water sensing networks. But nothing really resonated, and we wanted something more important. Eberhard was a supremely talented engineer with a do-gooder's social conscience. The United States' repeated conflicts in the Middle East bothered him, and like many other science-minded folks around 2000 he had started to accept global warming as a reality. Eberhard began looking for alternatives to gas-guzzling cars. He investigated the potential of hydrogen fuel cells but found them lacking. He also didn't see much point in leasing something like the EV1 electric car from General Motors. What did catch Eberhard's interest, however, were the all-electric cars from AC Propulsion that he spied on the internet. Eberhard went down to Los Angeles around 2001 to visit the AC Propulsion shop. The place looked like a ghost town and like they were going out of business, Eberhard said. I bailed them out with $500,000 so that they could build one of their cars for me with lithium-ion instead of lead-acid batteries. Eberhard too tried to goad AC Propulsion into being a commercial enterprise rather than a hobby shop. When they rejected his overtures, Eberhard decided to form his own company and see what the lithium-ion batteries could really do. Eberhard's journey began with him building a technical model of the electric car on a spreadsheet. This let him tweak various components and see how they might affect the vehicle's shape and performance. He could adjust the weight, number of batteries, resistance of the tires and body, and then get back answers on how many batteries it would take to power the various designs. The models made it clear that SUVs, which were very popular at the time, and things like delivery trucks were unlikely candidates. The technology seemed instead to favor a lighter weight, high-end sports car, which would be fast, fun to drive, and have far better range than most people would expect. These technical specifications complemented the findings of Tarpenning, who had been doing research into a financial model for the car. The Toyota Prius had started to take off in California, and it was being purchased by wealthy eco-crusaders. We also learned that the average income for EV1 owners was around $200,000 per year, Tarpenning said. People who used to go after the Lexus, BMW, and Cadillac brands saw electric and hybrid cars as a different kind of status symbol. The men figured they could build something for the $3 billion per year luxury auto market in the United States that would let rich people have fun and feel good about themselves too. People pay for cool and sexy and an amazing 0 to 60 time, Tarpenning said. On July 1, 2003, Eberhard and Tarpenning incorporated their new company. While at Disneyland a few months earlier on a date with his wife, Eberhard had come up with the name Tesla Motors, both to pay homage to the inventor and electric motor pioneer Nikola Tesla and because it sounded cool. The co-founders rented an office that had 3 desks and 2 small rooms in a decrepit 1960s building located at 845 Oak Grove Avenue in Menlo Park. The third desk was occupied a few months later by Ian Wright, an engineer who grew up on a farm in New Zealand. He was a neighbor of the Tesla co-founders in Woodside, and had been working with them to hone his pitch for a networking startup. When the startup failed to raise any money from venture capitalists, Wright joined Tesla. As the 3 men began to tell some of their confidants of their plans, they were confronted with universal derision. We met a friend at this Woodside pub to tell her what we had finally decided to do and that it was going to be an electric car, Tarpenning said. She said, "You have to be kidding me." Anyone who tries to build a car company in the United States is quickly reminded that the last successful startup in the industry was Chrysler, founded in 1925. Designing and building a car from the ground up comes with plenty of challenges, but it's really getting the money and know how to build lots of cars that has thwarted past efforts to get a new company going. The Tesla founders were aware of these realities. They figured that Nikola Tesla had built an electric motor a century earlier and that creating a drivetrain to take the power from the motor and send it to the wheels was doable. The really frightening part of their enterprise would be building the factory to make the car and its associated parts. But the more the Tesla guys researched the industry, the more they realized that the big automakers don't even really build their cars anymore. The days of Henry Ford having raw materials delivered to one end of his Michigan factory and then sending cars out the other end had long passed. BMW didn't make its windshields or upholstery or rearview mirrors, Tarpenning said. The only thing the big car companies had kept was internal combustion research, sales and marketing, and the final assembly. We thought, naively, that we could access all the same suppliers for our parts. The plan the Tesla co-founders came up with was to license some technology from AC propulsion around the Zero vehicle and to use the Lotus Elisa chassis for the body of their car. Lotus, the English carmaker, had released the two-door Elisa in 1996, and it certainly had the sleek, ground-hugging appeal to make a statement to high-end car buyers. After talking to a number of people in the car dealership business, the Tesla team decided to avoid selling their cars through partners and sell direct. With these basics of a plan in place, the three men went hunting for some venture capital funding in January 2004. To make things feel more real for the investors, the Tesla founders borrowed a Zero from AC propulsion and drove it to the venture capital corridor of Sand Hill Road. The car accelerated faster than a Ferrari, and this translated into visceral excitement for the investors. The downside, though, was that venture capitalists are not a terribly imaginative bunch, and they struggled to see past the crappy plastic finish of this glorified kit car. The only venture capitalists that bit were Compass Technology Partners and SDL Ventures, and they didn't sound altogether thrilled. The lead partner at Compass had made out well on Novomedia and felt some loyalty to Eberhard and Tarpenning. He said, "This is stupid, but I have invested in every automotive startup for the last 40 years, so why not?" Tarpenning recalled. Tesla still needed a lead investor who would pony up the bulk of the $7 million needed to make what's known as a mule or a prototype vehicle. That would be their first milestone and give them something physical to show off, which could aid a second round of funding. Eberhard and Tarpenning had Elon Musk's name in the back of their heads as a possible lead investor. From the outset, they had both seen him speak a couple of years earlier at a Mars Society conference held at Stanford, where Musk had laid out his vision of sending mice into space, and they got the impression that he thought a bit differently and would be open to the idea of an electric car. The idea to pitch Musk on Tesla Motors solidified when Tom Gage from AC Propulsion called Eberhard and told him that Musk was looking to fund something in the electric car arena. Eberhard and Wright flew down to Los Angeles and met with Musk on a Friday. That weekend, Musk peppered Tarpenning, who had been away on a trip, with questions about the financial model. "I just remember responding, and responding," Tarpenning said. The following Monday, Martin and I flew down to meet him again, and he said, "Okay, I'm in." The Tesla founders felt like they had lucked into the perfect investor. Musk had the engineering smarts to know what they were building. He also shared their larger goal of trying to end the United States' addiction to oil. You need angel investors to have some belief, and it wasn't a purely financial transaction for him, Tarpenning said. He wanted to change the energy equation of the country. With an investment of $6.5 million, Musk had become the largest shareholder of Tesla and the chairman of the company. Musk would later wield his position of strength well while battling Eberhard for control of Tesla. "It was a mistake," Eberhard said. "I wanted more investors. But, if I had to do it again, I would take his money. A bird in the hand, you know. We needed it." Not long after this meeting took place, Musk called Strobel and urged him to meet with the Tesla Team. Strobel heard that their offices in Menlo Park were about a half a mile from his house, and he was intrigued but very skeptical of their story. No one on the planet was more dialed into the electric vehicle scene than Strobel, and he found it hard to believe that a couple of guys had gotten this far along without word of their project reaching him. Nonetheless, Strobel stopped by the office for a meeting, and was hired right away in May 2004 at a salary of $95,000 per year. I told them that I had been building the battery pack they need down the street with funding from Elon, Strobel said. We agreed to join forces and formed this ragtag group. Had anyone from Detroit stopped by Tesla Motors at this point, they would have ended up in hysterics. The sum total of the company's automotive expertise was that a couple of the guys at Tesla really liked cars, and another one had created a series of science fair projects based on technology that the automotive industry considered ridiculous. What's more, the founding team had no intention of turning to Detroit for advice on how to build a car company. No, Tesla would do what every other Silicon Valley startup had done before it, which was hire a bunch of young, hungry engineers and figure things out as they went along. Never mind that the Bay Area had no real history of this model ever having worked for something like a car, and that building a complex, physical object had little in common with writing a software application. What Tesla did have, ahead of anyone else, was the realization that 18,650 lithium-ion batteries had gotten really good and were going to keep getting better. Hopefully that, coupled with some effort and smarts, would be enough. Strobel had a direct pipeline into the smart, energetic engineers at Stanford and told them about Tesla. Gene Barichevsky, one of the members of the solar-powered car team, lit up the second he heard from Strobel. An undergraduate, Barichevsky volunteered to quit school, work for free, and sweep the floors at Tesla if that's what it took to get a job. The founders were impressed with his spirit and hired Barichevsky after one meeting. This left Barichevsky in the uncomfortable position of calling his Russian immigrant parents, a pair of nuclear submarine engineers, to tell them that he was giving up on Stanford to join an electric car startup. As employee number 7, he spent part of the workday in the Menlo Park office and the rest in Strobel's living room designing three-dimensional models of the cars powertrain on a computer and building battery pack prototypes in the garage. Only now do I realize how insane it was, Barichevsky said. Tesla soon needed to expand to accommodate its budding engineer army and to create a workshop that would help bring the Roadster, as they were now calling the car, to life. They found a two-story industrial building in San Carlos at 1050 Commercial Street. The 10,000 square foot facility wasn't much, but it had room to build a research and development shop capable of knocking out some prototype cars. There were a couple of large assembly bays on the right side of the building and two large roll-up doors big enough for cars to drive in and out. Right divided the open floor space into segments: motors, batteries, power electronics, and final assembly. The left half of the building was an office space that had been modified in weird ways by the previous tenant, a plumbing supply company. The main conference room had a wet bar and a sink where the faucet was a swan's mouth, and the hot and cold knobs were wings. Barichevsky painted the office white on a Sunday night, and the next week the employees made a field trip to IKEA to buy desks and hopped online to order their computers from Dell. As for tools, Tesla had a single Craftsman toolbox loaded with hammers, nails, and other carpentry basics. Musk would visit now and again from Los Angeles and was unfazed by the conditions, having seen SpaceX grow up in similar surroundings. The original plan for producing a prototype vehicle sounded simple. Tesla would take the AC propulsion Zero powertrain and fit it into the Lotus Elise body. The company had acquired a schematic for an electric motor design and figured it could buy a transmission from a company in the United States or Europe and outsource any other parts from Asia. Tesla's engineers mostly needed to focus on developing the battery pack systems, wiring the car, and cutting and welding metal as needed to bring everything together. Engineers love to muck around with hardware, and the Tesla team thought of the Roadster as something akin to a car conversion project that could be done with 2 or 3 mechanical engineers and a few assembly people. The main team of prototype builders consisted of Strobel, Badichevsky, and David Leon, a very clever mechanical engineer and employee No. 12. Leon had about a decade of experience working for Silicon Valley companies and had met Strobel a few years before when the two men struck up a conversation at a 7-Eleven about an electric bike Strobel was riding. Leon had helped Strobel pay bills by hiring him as a consultant for a company building a device to measure people's core body temperature. Strobel thought he could return the favor by bringing Leon on early to such an exciting project. Tesla would benefit in a big way as well. As Badichevsky put it, Dave Leon knew how to get shit done. The engineers bought a blue lift for the car and set it up inside the building. They also purchased some machine tools, hand tools, and floodlights to work at night and started to turn the facility into a hotbed of R&D activity. Electrical engineers studied the Lotus's base-level software to figure out how it tied together the pedals, mechanical apparatus, and the dashboard gauges. The really advanced work took place with the battery pack design. No one had ever tried to combine hundreds of lithium-ion batteries in parallel, so Tesla ended up at the cutting edge of the technology. The engineers started trying to understand how heat would dissipate and current flow would behave across 70 batteries by supergluing them together into groups called bricks. Then 10 bricks would be placed together, and the engineers would test various types of air and liquid cooling mechanisms. When the Tesla team had developed a workable battery pack, they stretched the yellow Lotus Elisa chassis 5 inches and lowered the pack with a crane into the back of the car, where its engine would normally be. These efforts began in earnest on October 18, 2004, and, rather remarkably, 4 months later, on January 27, 2005, an entirely new kind of car had been built by 18 people. It could even be driven around. Tesla had a board meeting that day, and Musk zipped about in the car. He came away happy enough to keep investing. Musk put in $9 million more as Tesla raised a $13 million funding round. The company now planned to deliver the Roadster to consumers in early 2006. Once they'd finished building a second car a few months later, the engineers at Tesla decided they needed to face up to a massive potential flaw in their electric vehicle. On July 4, 2005, they were at Eberhard's house in Woodside celebrating Independence Day and figured it was as good a moment as any to see what happened when the Roadster's batteries caught on fire. Someone taped 20 of the batteries together, put a heating strip wire into the bundle, and set it off. It went up like a cluster of bottle rockets. Leon said, instead of 20 batteries, the Roadster would have close to 7,000, and the thought of it. An explosion at that scale would be like horrified the engineers. One of the perks of an electric car was meant to be that it moved people away from a flammable liquid like gasoline and the endless explosions that take place in an engine. Rich people were unlikely to pay a high price for something even more dangerous, and the early nightmare scenario for the employees at Tesla was that a rich, famous person would get caught in a fire caused by the car. It was one of those, oh shit, moments, Leon said. That is when we really sobered up. Tesla formed a 6-person task force to deal with the battery issue. They were pulled off all other work and given money to begin running experiments. The first explosions started taking place at the Tesla headquarters, where the engineers filmed them in slow motion. Once saner minds prevailed, Tesla moved its explosion research to a blast area behind an electrical substation maintained by the fire department. Blast by blast, the engineers learned a great deal about the inner workings of the batteries. They developed methods for arranging them in ways that would prevent fires spreading from one battery to the next, and other techniques for stopping explosions altogether. Thousands of batteries exploded along the way, and the effort was worth it. It was still early days, for sure, but Tesla was on the verge of inventing battery technology that would set it apart from rivals for years to come and would become one of the company's great advantages. The early success at building 2 prototype cars, coupled with Tesla's engineering breakthroughs around the batteries and other technological pieces, boosted the company's confidence. It was time to put Tesla's stamp on the vehicle. The original plan had been to do the bare minimum we could get away with. As far as making the car stylistically different from a Lotus but electric, said Tapening. Along the way, Elon and the rest of the board said, you only get to do this once. It has to delight the customer, and the Lotus just isn't good enough to do that. The Elysis chassis, or base frame, worked fine for Tesla's engineering purposes. But the body of the car had serious issues in both form and function. The door on the Elysis was all of a foot tall, and you were meant to either jump into the car or fall into it, depending on your flexibility and/or dignity. The body also needed to be longer to accommodate Tesla's battery pack and a trunk. And Tesla preferred to make the Roadster out of carbon fiber instead of fiberglass. On these design points, Musk had a lot of opinion and influence. He wanted a car that Justin could feel comfortable getting into and that had some measure of practicality. Musk made these opinions clear when he visited Tesla for board meetings and design reviews. Tesla hired a handful of designers to mock up new looks for the Roadster. After settling on a favorite, the company paid to build a quarter-scale model of the vehicle in January 2005 and then a full-scale model in April. This process provided the Tesla executives with yet another revelation of everything that went into making a car. They wrapped this shiny mylar material around the model and vacuum it, so that you can really see the contours and shine and shadows, Tapening said. The silver model was then turned into a digital rendering that the engineers could manipulate on their computers. A British company took the digital file and used it to create a plastic version of the car called an Aerobug for aerodynamics testing. They put it on a boat and shipped it to us, and then we took it to Burning Man, Tapening said, referring to the annual drug-infused art festival held in the Nevada desert. About a year later, after many tweaks and much work, Tesla had a pencils down moment. It was May 2006, and the company had grown to 100 employees. This team built a black version of the Roadster known as Ape 1, or Engineering Prototype 1. It was saying, we now think we know what we will build, Tapening said. You can feel it. It's a real car, and it's very exciting. The arrival of the Ape 1 provided a great excuse to show existing investors what their money had bought and to ask for more funds from a wider audience. The venture capitalists were impressed enough to overlook the fact that engineers sometimes had to manually fan the car to cool it down in between test drives and were now starting to grasp Tesla's long-term potential. Musk once again put money into Tesla, $12 million, and a handful of other investors, including the venture capital firm Draper Fisher Jurvetson, Vantage Point Capital Partners, J.P. Morgan, Compass Technology Partners, Nick Pritzker, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin joined the $40 million round. In July 2006, Tesla decided to tell the world what it had been up to. The company's engineers had built a red prototype, Ape 2, to complement the black one, and they both went on display at an event in Santa Clara. The press flocked to the announcement and were quite taken with what they saw. The Roadsters were gorgeous, two-seater convertibles that could go from 0 to 60 in about 4 seconds. Until today, Musk said at the event, all electric cars have sucked. 6. Celebrities like then-Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and former Disney CEO Michael Eisner showed up at the event, and many of them took test rides in the Roadsters. The vehicles were so fragile that only Strobel and a couple of other trusted hands knew how to run them, and they were swapped out every 5 minutes to avoid overheating. Tesla revealed that each car would cost about $90,000 and had a range of 250 miles per charge. 30 people, the company said, had committed to buying a Roadster, including the Google co-founders Brin and Page and a handful of other technology billionaires. Musk promised that a cheaper car, a 4-seat, 4-door model under $50,000, would arrive in about 3 years. Around the time of this event, Tesla made its debut in the New York Times via a mini profile on the company. Eberhard vowed, optimistically, to begin shipments of the Roadster in the middle of 2007. Instead of early 2006 as once planned, and laid out Tesla's strategy of starting with a high-priced, low-volume product and moving down to more affordable products over time, as underlying technology and manufacturing capabilities advance. Musk and Eberhard were big believers in this strategy, having seen It play out with a number of electronic devices. Cell phones, refrigerators, color TVs, they didn't start off by making a low-end product for masses, Eberhard told the paper. 7. They were relatively expensive for people who could afford it. While the story was a coup for Tesla, Musk didn't appreciate being left out of the article entirely. We tried to emphasize him, and told the reporter about him over and over again, but they weren't interested in the board of the company, Tapening said. Elon was furious. He was livid. You could understand why Musk might want some of the shine of Tesla to rub off on him. The car had turned into a cause célèbre of the automotive world. Electric vehicles tended to invoke religious overreactions from both the pro and con camps, and the appearance of a good-looking, fast electric car stoked everyone's passions. Tesla had also turned Silicon Valley into a real threat, at least conceptually, to Detroit for the first time. The month after the Santa Monica event was the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, a famous showcase for exotic cars. Tesla had become such a topic of conversation that the organizers of the event begged to have a roadster and waived the usual display fees. Tesla set up a booth, and people showed up by the dozens writing $100,000 checks on the spot to pre-order their cars. This was long before Kickstarter, and we just had not thought of trying to do that, Tapening said. But then, we started getting millions of dollars at these types of events. Venture capitalists, celebrities, and friends of Tesla employees began trying to buy their way onto the waiting list. Some of Silicon Valley's wealthy elite went so far as to show up at the Tesla office and knock on the door, looking to buy a car. The entrepreneurs Konstantin Udmar and Bruce League, who had known Musk from his internship days at Rocket Science Games, did just that one weekday and ended up getting a personal tour of the car from Musk and Eberhard that stretched over a couple of hours. At the end we said, we'll take one, Udmar said. They weren't actually allowed to sell cars yet, though, so we joined their club. It cost $100,000, but one of the benefits of membership was that you'd get a free car. As Tesla switched from marketing back into R&D mode, it had some trends working in its favor. Advances in computing had made it so that small car companies could sometimes punch at the same weight as the giants of the industry. Years ago, automakers would have needed to make a fleet of cars for crash testing. Tesla could not afford to do that, and it didn't have to. The third Roadster engineering prototype went to the same collision testing facility used by large automakers, giving Tesla access to top-of-the-line high-speed cameras and other imaging technology. Thousands of other tests, though, were done by a third party that specialized in computer simulations and saved Tesla from building a fleet of crash vehicles. Tesla also had equal access to the big guys' durability tracks made out of cobblestones and concrete embedded with metal objects. It could replicate 100,000 miles and 10 years of wear at these facilities.